Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am in the heart of Chicago in the middle of December, and you know what that means, don't you? It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. And that means Jesus is making headlines, as he does every year at this time. But what does Jesus and Chicago have in common? Stick around, you'll find out in about 10 seconds. It's time for another episode of the History Behind the Headline. If this is your first time here, you should know that I like to make videos on America's religious, political, and economic past. I take a historical perspective rather than a current events perspective because I have a master's degree in U.S. history. And on occasion, I might use some humor. Some people tell me not enough, but I take all the subjects seriously. Back in my undergraduate days when I was a student here at UIC, I took a course on the history of Chicago. And one of the books that was required reading was this one. And this was the book I had to read in public university, If Christ Came to Chicago by William Stead. This book was published in 1894, 126 years ago. And supposedly it sold 70,000 copies on the first day of publication. I was really surprised that that was a required book because it wasn't a religious course, it was a history class. But it turns out that the professor was using it because it was written by a British journalist, and the historical information that was in there was why he assigned the book to the class. Now, what was Stead doing in Chicago to begin with? Well, he was here as a journalist to cover the World Columbian Exposition, 1893. This was a grand display of Chicago's international status, its effort to present the world a city that is high culture, sophisticated, fun, and he's here for that. But when he gets here, sure, there's all the what you would expect to see, the trappings, the white buildings, which gives the city the the white city name, but he also sees things that even the World Columbian Exposition couldn't hide. If you visit Chicago today, this is what you'd see driving around the city like I'm doing here. William Stead visited Chicago in the late 1890s, however, and his book is based on what he saw back then. And if I had to sum up Stead's description of Chicago in the late 1890s, the three words that best describe Chicago are stink, stank, and stunk. More specifically, Stead was appalled by two things: poverty and corruption. More than anything else at the time, he sees Chicagoans are suffering due to high unemployment, which is visible throughout the city, and also that the city is suffering because of political corruption, namely City Hall. But why mention Jesus Christ? What's that about? Well, the cover of the book begins, If Christ Came to Chicago, but you'd have to open it to find how he finishes that thought. He says, if he came to Chicago, what would he think of us and our lives? A weird question? Not really. Stead's book fits right into the social reform movements of the day. That's what history students know as women's rights, child labor, the temperance movement. Now, this video won't be a complete review of Stead's nearly 500-page book, but let me just say that he does interview lots of people for the book, like the good newspaper man that he is, and the characters in the book and the stories that they tell reinforce the city's big problem with poverty and corruption. And the fact that Stead's an outsider, he's a British, not a local guy, means he doesn't worry about stepping on the toes of powerful local people. He is, in fact, trying to upset the established order. He's got a bone to pick with the city of big shoulders. Now, keep in mind that this is before Al Capone's Chicago. In fact, William Stead is describing a corrupt Chicago 30 years before Al Capone became the city's most famous crime boss. Think about that. So this is way, way back. I mean, when Stead visited Chicago in 1893, the Chicago Cubs hadn't even existed. And they're one of the oldest baseball teams in America. And yes, that's Harry Carey. Now you can find a PDF version of Stead's book on this website from Northwestern University, and I'll include a link in the description to this site. But I want to dive right into Stead's main thesis. This explains the title of the book and his main purpose in writing it. Keep in mind, he's writing to a Christian audience of the time. He quotes from the Gospel of Matthew, where Matthew, a disciple of Jesus, who was a hated tax collector, which, by the way, just goes to show you how willing Jesus was to associate himself with supposed dregs of society. Anyhow, he quotes Matthew's retelling of the parable of the sheep and the goats. Stead says the story reveals that on the last day, Christ will judge the nations by this measuring stick. Let's pick it up here. I quote, therefore, the words of our Lord as the final authority on this point, if he came to Chicago. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry, and fed you, or thirsty, and gave you drink? When did we see you a stranger, and took you in, or naked, and clothed you? Or when did we see you sick, or in prison, and came to visit you? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, insomuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. So, Stead says that the test that Christ will administer, quote, so far as can be ascertained from his teaching, the only test which he will apply is whether or not we have ministered to the physical, social, and moral necessities of our fellow man. His words are so distinct and so precise that there is not getting away from them. And what are those again? Feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, showing hospitality to the stranger, and visiting those who are sick or in prison. Now, William Stead is one of the passengers who died on the Titanic in 1912. This is one of the last photos of him before he died. Now, Chicagoans did read his book. There were several thousand copies published and circulated, but in the end, they really didn't do a whole lot to implement his public policy issues. For example, he said that the city should have warming centers to help residents cope with those brutal Chicago cold weather days, like they have in Paris. And he was an international traveler, and so he knew Chicago always fancied itself, or wanted to fancy itself, as an international city of high culture and so forth. The World Columbian Exposition was evidence of this, and so he kind of gives them a dig in that regard. But for the most part, it's just, with the exception of the founding of the Civic Federation, he really doesn't have a great impact in terms of what he recommends in this book. But he does end it on a very personal note, an appeal to the Christians in the city. And I want to close by what he says here. And I just want to warn you ahead of time, he does get a bit preachy. You know how journalists are. If Christ came to Chicago, what would he wish me to do? And that, of course, is a reference to just the Christian call to be like Christ, to have the attributes and attitude of Christ towards your fellow man, love your neighbor as yourself, and so forth. But he goes on to say, the more you disbelieve in Christianity as it is caricatured, the more earnestly should you labor to live the life and to manifest the love, and if need be, to die the death of Jesus of Nazareth. Even if you doubt whether he ever really lived, God incarnate in mortal flesh, the more imperative is your duty to endeavor so far as you can to realize in your own person that supreme embodiment of love, in order that now, if never before, there may be on earth a Messiah of God who is love among men who are perishing for want of love. Be a Christ. Everything is summed up in that. What would Christ do, he says, if he came to Chicago in these last days and were living in your circumstances? Even so, you do. And do it not once or twice or in moments of spiritual ecstasy or moral enthusiasm, but do it all the time. What Christ would do if he came to Chicago in these last days? Each day's duties at home or at work, every friend whom you love, every acquaintance with you form, every occasion where a duty confronts you, and every opportunity where you can manifest love by word or deed or look, there and then you can be Christ, he says. Are you willing to help? If Christ came to your city, would he find you ready? If so, you will not have long to wait. He says, remember to do it the least of these, my brethren, and you do it to Christ. For what he would have you to do is to follow in his footsteps and be a Christ to those among you in the family, in the workplace, in the city, and in the state. Be a Christ. That's all I have for now. So thank you for watching. And if you'd like to know more, be sure to read the notes that I left in the description with some links for additional information. And remember, the past is never dead. It isn't even past.